Yes, if you can hear me, I'm pleased to welcome you to this event tonight, which is organized by ISACA, Mauritius chapter, and Mobius Consulting. So I thank you very much for having been connected. And I present myself, I'm the president of ISACA Mauritius chapter. And we are trying to organize some events regarding to IT audit, which is going to go through months ago. And I also thank you a lot to be here. And I see that we do have some participants who are not here yet, but nevertheless, we will continue to go forward with our program. And as a matter of fact, since not everyone is here, so if you have any questions, you can just go through the chat link so that we can reply to you afterwards. And also, there will be a survey down the line, and there will also be a lucky draw at the end of this event, where one of you will get a lucky draw. So without keeping you much delayed, I'll just shift to the speaker for the day, who is Candice Jamieson. She's a CISA, CIA, CISM, CIPM, and CDPSP. She has more than 16 years experience in the field that we are talking around, IT assurance, risk consulting, and as well, she has been doing internal and external auditing. And she has worked also with a multinational corporate environment. So she's going to show you what she's going to present to right now. But before that, she is someone who is very knowledgeable in IT assurance, governance, risk, compliance, information privacy, data protection, security, TPRM, and disability. So I won't take much of your time. I prefer that I'll shift you to Candice, who is going to get this talk on, but ensure that there is a QR code on the screen. Make sure that you scan it, and you'll get into that lucky draw afterwards, and the survey as well. Please do it, because it's going to help us a lot to understand what you're doing. Thank you very much. And I'll leave the floor to Candice, who will take over now.
Thank you so much, Agesh. Good evening, everybody. Just going to quickly start my video. Thank you very much for taking out your time this evening to join us on this session. Yogesh did initially kind of just give a high-level overview. If you want to and you need any technical support or issues, just utilize the chat kind of functionality at the bottom of your little view browser. And similarly, if you have any questions and answers, please just populate those in the Q&A box as we go through the presentation. We'll be keeping all the questions at the end of the session. If you want to send those questions anonymously, just remember to tag or flag the little send anonymously little radio button before you send. And at the end of the session, it would be really great to just hear from you guys, hear your comments, your questions, your queries, and then yeah, we can take things from there. So just a little bit of a view in terms of what the agenda is for this evening. I'll go through a little bit of an introduction just to kind of set the scene and give you a little bit of context as to where we're going to be going through with the chat. What I'll do is also then take you through a bit of a history between the past, present, and future of IT audit. So where it originated, what usually it was kind of contextualized or framed around, and usually what you would have seen in terms of what would be on an audit plan in the past. Then I'll shoot through to the present and what we currently see a lot of in the industry and where we see things going to in the future. I'll then close out just with highlighting trends in terms of what we've seen with our clients and what we've been involved with presently from a services or kind of service delivery side of things in the various markets that we operate in. Just in terms of a little bit of a high level around Mobius Consulting. Mobius Consulting and myself, I operate within the Mobius Consulting South Africa space. I'm in the Cape Town team. We're here helping out Lavna, who is a member of the Mobius group. She operates out of Mauritius for Mobius Consulting Mauritius. And then we do also have offices in the UK and some of our other group companies that operate out of Ireland. So we do service, globally these related services, but the intention of today's discussion was, because I am what we term the tech assurance service line or the IT audit service line leader, I reached out to Lavna, or similarly Lavna reached out to me, and the aim was to just kind of get a view and get some thought leadership out there on what is happening and what has kind of happened within the IT audit or IT technical assurance space. So if anything, it was quite ironic. I went through to the ISACA annual conference up in Johannesburg here in South Africa on Monday and Tuesday this week, and one of the presenters kind of stole my thunder a bit. I was, he asked just generally to the audience, what happened in 1969, and people threw out things like it was Woodstock. We had someone land on the moon. The beginnings of the internet were founded. A whole lot of people threw a bunch of things out of what happened in 1969. But ironically, what also happened in 1969 was the establishment of ISACA. It wasn't called ISACA back then. It had a slightly different name, but essentially the beginnings of IT auditing, or being able to place some type of reliance on what was happening with regards to computing and the introduction of technology, essentially was where ISACA came from. And that's, that was the same time. And you think back to it, it was quite some time ago, but that's how long ISACA and the principles of ISACA have kind of been around. So obviously from that, you kind of get a view that there's been a lot of growth in terms of IT involvement and the growing role of IT in business. There's also been a lot of automation. There's this global interconnectedness and essentially this integration and communication that's happening because of IT systems. And essentially there are also a lot of changing external factors such as regulation. So all of this ultimately, if they thought this kind of stuff was important in 1969, you can be sure that it's even more important now, more than 50 years later. So a lot has changed, and essentially because of that, we are obligated to kind of walk that journey and kind of amend and adapt our practices to make sure that we are still relevant and that we are helping wherever possible to mitigate the risks that are kind of emerging and coming out of the various technology advancements within all of our areas, within all of the industries, within all of the businesses across the world. So if anything, you're going to see a little bit of a theme running through my presentation. In a previous life, I used to always, I'd hoped to kind of play tennis semi-professionally and go overseas and go to a university and work and live there and play tennis. Unfortunately, wasn't good enough for that. So here I am as an IT consultant. But what I then utilized was this opportunity to say, you can see that there is the changing game of tennis. The rules have somewhat stayed the same. The principles are the same, but there've been changes. There've been changes in terms of the tools and techniques of the trade. People who've got, from a wooden racket to graphite rackets to now, if you watch some paddle tennis, which is an emerging sport here and around the world, in terms of people playing almost like action tennis, what you will see is that although the principles of the game have stayed the same, there have definitely been changes and advancements for the betterment of either athletes or for competition or for audiences to be able to watch and participate and be part of, a great game. So if you were to look at IT audit in the past, you would see that, or IT assessments in the past, you would see that they are very heavily reliant on an external audit scope or requirement. So if there is a mandatory obligation for a large organization to be on a stock exchange, there would be a view that you would need to get audited. And as part of that audit, your external audit team would say, well, you guys are utilizing systems to create or generate financial statements. So there is some expectation of being able to understand and place reliance on the systems, that they would then go to an IT audit department or an external audit, IT audit department, to give some view of, can we trust the systems that this company has in place and that are generating the financial statements that we're looking towards auditing. Because of that reliance on external audit scope, you'll see that the kind of audit plans were very heavily focused on financial controls and then otherwise just business operations. And what you saw was that internal audit was very much a completely independent party that kind of stood on the sidelines and gave a very, very objective view to what had particularly gone on in the past. So there was a view of a very looking backwards and providing assurance over a time period for specific controls. It was very much kind of checklist focused. So there was a very limited kind of depth of detail that internal auditors or assurance providers would be kind of going into. And what would kind of be the output out of these assessments or these reviews would be a long Word document, pages and pages of audit findings with recommendations, risk ratings, a lot of wordy either physical reports or more recently electronic Word documents. I know, and when I started on my journey, we were very much involved in terms of creating or maintaining paper-based audit files. So I recall days of walking around with huge reams of paper, physically signing documents and performing QA on paper files. And what you also saw is that there was very much kind of in the internal audit space, especially a fixed annual audit plan. And there was very, very little IT audit coverage, if any. So if there was an IT audit and you were lucky enough to have an IT audit on your annual audit plan, it would be in the form of some type of a, general IT general controls review. And there'd probably only be one of those for a very key IT system within the organization. And what you did see is also that plan or that scope was exclusively kind of developed and kind of agreed with the audit or audit and risk committees. So there was very much a focus on preventative controls and risk mitigation. So where you would look at in terms of what the recommendations out of a lot of those reviews would have been, it would have been what preventative controls can you put in place to mitigate specific risks. So in terms of, like I just alluded to earlier, what types of reviews would you typically have seen? We had IT general control reviews, so reviews focused on access, change, disaster recovery, application control reviews, so reviews of specific applications that were in scope, interface control reviews where systems possibly spoke to each other or essentially were connected through some type of an actual interface. And then you also had a view of possibly doing some project assurance. So having internal audit retrospectively look at a project and validate that it went through the correct kind of project life cycle and the correct project governance was applied. I think what also was something that was commonplace was if you were doing large data migrations, there would be some validity or some type of request for internal audit to get involved and get a view of the accuracy, the completeness of the transfer of data from one system to another. What also was starting to be quite kind of topical was there's an acronym there, CATS, so essentially computer assisted auditing techniques. So essentially data analytics where an external audit or an internal audit team would try and get the IT audit team to help and utilize scripts and data sets to get full sample testing. So not necessarily just taking a specific sample of transactions and validating that they had kind of moved through the system in a correct or accurate and complete way, but also then to validate that for a whole entire bunch of transactions over a specific time period using some type of a scripting tool or an application which specialized in almost reperforming what the system was doing and then comparing that to the system output or what the system was ultimately saying the data should or would look like. So then I wanted to kind of jump to the present And in terms of the present and what we currently doing right now is that there's now not necessarily just a focus on what the external auditors want to have a look at and what is kind of a financial control around a system. We've seen a lot of what are the compliance requirements. So a new legislation, new regulation will pop up, and all of a sudden there'll be a view to say, are we ready for this regulation? Have we implemented what we need to be compliant? What you'll see then is, instead of it being around general controls, it is around IT controls and operations, but there is an element of more towards focusing on the emergence or the starting of specific projects and getting involved slightly earlier in the process versus being kind of a historical looking backwards view. There is very much still a strong view of independence, but there is an element of advisory focus which is kind of creeping in, where your internal audit is being seen to be being able to provide some specialized guidance, or at least some input into the implementation of systems or the creation of projects, the development of systems, so that they can bake in and build controls into that process and probably preempt any specific concerns that the audit team might have. Instead of being a checkbox exercise, what you'll see is there's a lot of utilization of frameworks and standards. So if you're doing something in the security space, there would be a view of, let's compare how we're doing with an ISO 27000 kind of standard, or a NIST standard, or a CIS standard. And what you also will see is that there's not necessarily this black or white. Is something effective, operating effectively, but rather where are we on this maturity journey? And if anything, it's to try and get a better view or a deeper dive into a specific place, to not necessarily just say, look, we can't provide assurance, you're dead in the water, here's a list of 100 findings. What we're doing is giving the client, or in this case, the actual IT or management team, a view of where you are on that journey. So how far along are you from being and having 100% effective controls where the audit team can place reliance on specific controls. From a reporting perspective, like I mentioned earlier, instead of having reams and reams of paper documents and paper reports, many pages long, what we're seeing is a migration towards people utilizing PowerPoint as a reporting format, integrating visual displays of progress, so dashboards, graphs, that kind of stuff. And what we also have seen in terms of moving away from paper-based kind of practices is that there are a lot of electronic working paper tool sets out there. So essentially the audit program, everything is maintained within either some type of a purpose-built tool specifically for audit working papers, or otherwise what we've seen people do is utilize things like Teams and the Office stack to create SharePoint sites, or otherwise implementing kind of the creation of online working papers through some type of a custom in-house developed system. As we referenced, or what I referenced in the past in terms of from an IT audit plan perspective, where historically that was very much an IT audit, or an audit plan, sorry, with a very small IT audit element. What we're seeing now is that there's very definitely a standalone IT audit plan, and there's very much a view that time is set aside specifically for a few ad hoc requests that might kind of pop up during the year. So it isn't necessarily something that's set in stone. There is a little bit of wiggle room in terms of maybe getting or wanting to have visibility of what might need to be seen or looked at in the future, or as part of the year ahead. What we do see is that the audit plan is still exclusively or mostly or predominantly driven by an audit and risk committee. And if you're lucky, there's some type of other pull or push from other parties just to see whether or not they can nudge something within that audit plan scope for the year. Other than that, what you can see is that there's definitely a focus away from preventative controls, more towards detective controls. And instead of risk remediation, you get risk mitigation or risk avoidance popping out a lot more. So the transition you see there is then this visibility or this view that we can't prevent everything. We need to have a layered approach. So even if we can't prevent something and we do get someone who manages to get past those defenses, let's recommend a bunch of detective controls that then add that extra layer of protection for the business, that extra layer of then being able to see, once people have managed to circumvent initial controls, do we and how fast can we see that that has occurred? And then similar to the risk mitigation is around being able to reduce risk, or even have or introduce the opportunity for people to avoid risk. So that's what we're seeing a lot in terms of what's in the present. If you look at what are the kind of audits we're seeing, or what people are doing from an internal audit perspective, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of maturity assessment. So not necessarily just around kind of, you know, you've passed or you are implementing the controls, we can rely on this, we can't rely on this. There's a little bit of a deeper view in terms of getting a maturity assessment out. There's also a lot of compliance preparedness reviews, so prepping or being able to look at an organization and being able to say, we are on track, we are on our way to getting to a state where we are going to be compliant, or we will be compliant by the time a specific regulation kind of materializes. And what we've also seen is a lot around kind of being able to respond or focus on the response of an organization and what controls they have in place to kind of fix things once things have kind of already gone wrong. So again, it moves away from that preventative to more of a, well, if something does go wrong, how would this organization do in terms of responding to something? So where there are things like a disaster recovery plan, where there are things like a cyber incident response plan, how are those things in practice being tested and operationally kind of matured and managed so that there's that reactive ability for the business to kind of bounce back. What we also see is a lot more around combined assurance. So combined assurance essentially is this layer or this level of the business isn't simply relying on internal audit for assurance. What they're doing is they're looking at your other levels or your other layers of defense for that visibility. So there's an element of being able to rely on self-assessments performed by management. There's also the ability to possibly rely on any risk reviews, or where a risk or a governance function performs some type of assessment. And then similarly, you'll have external parties where they come into the organization, or where they have an interest. If you have an external body who mandates or requires some type of a check or an audit, what you'll see is now there isn't just that assurance that you're getting from internal audit. You're able to almost stack all of those views of the business from those various parties and be able to give the Audit and Risk Committee a more holistic view in terms of who and how people are seeing the control environment at any point in time. And what we've also really seen is a very high demand for specialized technical assurance reviews. So as mentioned with kind of what was in the past, there was this focus on IT general control reviews and just kind of more governance and conceptual elements of how an IT department is kind of run. What we do now see is views of saying, I want someone to independently validate that my firewall rules are correct. I want someone to independently validate that my migration to a specific cloud service provider has been configured securely. So that's also something we're seeing. And then what we also have been getting or having visibility of is this desire or this requirement or need for people to create an independent attestation on behalf of the business internally that can be possibly shared with external service providers as part of some type of a third-party risk management functional service that the internal audit offers the business. Similarly to, in the past, there definitely is computer-assisted auditing, but there is also the element of continuous auditing and automated controls testings. So essentially, some people have almost configured up within some of their ERP systems a test that runs with little to no intervention from the internal audit team, which runs through transactions and just literally highlights exceptions as and when they occur, and passes that on to the management team for kind of rectification or remediation or control, kind of control tweaking. So that's something that we're definitely seeing in the present. Then in terms of a little bit of a look into the future, This is something that, you know, we definitely seeing the emergence of, or the start of, but we do think that this is the way that, you know, IT audit is starting to kind of go to, and will start being, you know, will become the present in the very near future. So that's where, instead of relying on the external financial audit kind of requirements, there's now a focus on business strategy and compliance. So compliance was kind of what we're seeing the main driver to be currently. What we do see is more as business being that value driver, that business enabler, and that being then something which ultimately drives the requirements and the focus of internal audit. It will be on strategic initiatives and high risks. So there'll be better visibility of where to kind of best utilize internal audit for the, you know, the biggest bang for buck, where you're really going to get the most value in terms of putting your efforts from an internal audit resourcing perspective. What we also are going to see is that there is this being a trusted advisor. So although we are independent, there is some expectation, and what we definitely have seen just from the sheer shortage of people in the IT kind of governance risk space, from a security, from a privacy perspective, is that there is inherently this requirement, or this need to ask anyone who has knowledge, anyone who can help, to help. So what we're seeing is that there is this kind of dual hat that internal audit has to kind of play, and, you know, step through a very fine line in terms of where you can be possibly that trusted advisor, where you can be involved from things from the start and get involved throughout a project lifecycle, versus historically just kind of looking back at something, so that you can help mature an organization and expedite and speed up risk mitigation and control development within an organization. What we've seen, instead of having like a standalone working paper or audit plan system, we've seen integrated governance, risk and compliance tool sets. So something where your enterprise risk function feeds in a view of what the risks are within an organization, a business entity or business partners providing input into that, and then the IT auditors or the audit team coming in and ratifying specific controls. So it's a lot more kind of a closed ecosystem in terms of there being a thread that runs through everything that everyone does, and makes the holistic organizational entity work towards a more focused and a more collaborative goal. Similarly, from a reporting perspective, it's not going to be even in a PowerPoint presentation anymore. I think what you're going to do is the audit and risk committees are going to expect to kind of be able to log on to some type of a dashboard, see a bunch of red, amber, greens, highlight very specific concerns at any point in time. So there's not going to be this, you know, biannual audit committee where you meet and you present and you spend hours and hours creating a board pack. It's going to be something that inherently, at any point in time, if that person has a concern, if that committee has a concern, they can log on to a system and kind of get real-time feedback as to where you are on an audit plan, what are the current high risks that have been identified, a lot more of an interactive and ability for people to drill down as in where they want or have interests in a specific kind of audit or audit findings within an audit. We've also seen a lot around electronic working papers and the element of workflows. So essentially what we're seeing now is that, you know, you would capture all of your findings on a Excel spreadsheet, and there would be follow-ups where you'd have to go and facilitate the follow-up of those specific findings and how controls are progressing in terms of their adequacy and effectiveness. What we're seeing is a lot of people integrating workflow into that. So essentially, once an audit finding has been kind of raised, it lives within an ecosystem, and then at a certain point in time, an email will fire off with an action to the finding owner to say, how is this finding doing? Where are you? How, you know, if you have implemented the specific recommendations, can you upload evidence to ratify or validate that? And it takes a lot of the workload from the auditors off their shoulders in terms of having to go to the business and perform that. So it aims to try and alleviate that kind of audit fatigue, and for people to really, the business to really take ownership of where they're going, what they're doing, and how they're wanting to mitigate risk. it essentially still is then, instead of being an IT audit plan and a business audit plan, what we're seeing, or what we do see it to be, is going to be a fully integrated IT and business audit plan. And there will be very specific placeholders or kind of gaps within the actual annual plan for ad hoc reviews, or reviews which are pertinent at a very specific point in time and need to kind of get done. And that being very intentionally some time or capacity of the teams being kept aside for that. And there's also a little bit of a view, or there is definitely a view in terms of the acknowledgement and the consideration of business risk appetite. So internal audit, getting the business to commit to and surface and very openly and plainly and honestly be transparent about the risk, what the risk appetite is. And that kind of then mitigates that view of where, the audit team seem to be too conservative, or suggesting or recommending controls which are deemed to be too onerous, or are going to be too costly for the business, and allows everyone to be very transparent in terms of the risks that the business is taking, and the willing or the extent of which controls and the cost of controls is going to be kind of agreed by the business. So from a focus perspective, it's on the responsive controls or the reactive controls. And there's also an element of not just risk reduction, but even risk acceptance. So what we're seeing now is very much a process to say, if we're going to accept this risk, how do we surface it? How do we make it more transparent? It is an option, but there is a very specific process and a robust review of that acceptance process, which needs to kind of be established. So just in terms of what we're seeing, what are the types of audits? So very specialized technical assurance reviews, independent attestation, so where the internal audit team is being asked to either provide some type of a view, or an external party being asked to provide a view of the control environment. We've got the continuous auditing and automated controls testing again. We've got the introduction of robotic process automation. The element of data governance and data ethics is something which is something, that is definitely going to have to kind of come out onto the cards. A view of artificial intelligence, the importance or an element of awareness and education of board members and executive members around IT and IT risks, and then an element around business resilience and being able to react or respond to issues or IT risks that may materialize. And then lastly, there's a very clear view around benchmarking, this visibility across industry to know where my competitors are, where we are within the pecking order, within the rank. There's a lot of expectation around, we know where we sit, but where do we sit amongst our peers? So just one or two trends. Sorry, hopefully the next session will be, or the next section will be, where you have your opportunities to pick our brains. But from a trend perspective, what we've seen is internal audit functions are more and more looking towards co-sourcing, or having a co-source arrangement with external service providers. That's both from a capacity and a skills perspective. So if there is a specific time of year when there are a lot of audits, they want to be able to leverage off a specific service provider to kind of just beef up their team with bodies and people. And sometimes there is also, or there is definitely a requirement for skills. So having been in an internal audit position myself, I know that leading a team can be quite an uphill struggle in terms of retaining talent, upskilling talent. It can be very expensive in terms of keeping very specialized resources in-house. So what we have seen is that there is this co-sourcing arrangement to leverage off skills that are maintained outside of the organization, if and when relevant. In terms of the specialist reviews, we've seen reviews around emergent technologies, process reviews of things like AWS, Azure, stuff in the cloud, DevSecOps, a lot around where an internal audit division might not necessarily have the relevance of what's happening in the emerging technologies to have that ability to say, look, this is a good idea, a bad idea, this does or doesn't introduce risk. And I think the board and the audit committee are just as wary and just as much interested to get some type of assurance over the fact that although we're leveraging emerging technologies to gain a strategic advantage, what is the risk that that specific technology or a process might introduce to my business? What we're also seeing is a view of the internal audit team being asked to validate remediation work. So if there's a regulatory requirement which says you have to do X, Y, and Z, or a regulatory body comes in and says you're not doing X, Y, and Z, there is a bit of a view where the Audit and Risk Committee want the internal audit department to kind of go in and say, yes, we independently can validate that there is progress being made. So that when the regulator comes through to the organization, they're not merely just relying on hearsay from management around how things are going, but they actually have an independent view of how things have been going in that process, and then say, yes, we definitely are, getting traction in this space, and this space, but these are still kind of our gaps or still some issues that we're working on. What you're also seeing is IT audit being involved in terms of being able to attest to very specific standards. So again, it's kind of pulls from that regulatory requirement where a regulation stipulates the enforcement of a standard. The internal audit department is often being approached to say, can you vet or can you validate that independent of IT management that you are implementing these specific standards? And then one of the other areas we're seeing, and which is going to kind of just grow and grow and grow, is this whole third-party risk management element, and the fact that externally there is this increasing compliance obligation through data protection laws. I know in Mauritius, your data protection law is very similar to the one in South Africa here, which mandates an element of knowing or seeing behind what your third parties are doing in terms of processing your data, and not necessarily just kind of being able to say, oh, we've outsourced the risk to this third party. You ultimately still are the custodians and the owners of the data, and therefore you have to get some type of visibility in terms of what your environment looks like. So where we've seen internal audit getting very heavily involved is that that's usually the first step before a SOC type 2 or a very independent kind of certified or kind of signed off document is created. There's this request for internal audit to create these reports or create this view that your organization can share with third parties when they ask you or they perform their due diligence on you as an organization. What we've also seen is the updating of kind of reporting templates. So to the point of where I was kind of highlighting that journey between there being the reports were very long-winded paper-based Word documents, then now through to, very much like a bit of a dashboard and a pack through some type of a PowerPoint presentation, through to this more dynamic kind of, I don't know what you call dashboard that someone can log on and look at. That's where we've seen a lot of kind of development where internal audits are trying to reframe and reposition the way that they report or highlight gaps that they are finding. And similarly, as I kind of alluded to in terms of the future around automating the following up of findings or the following up of risks, making that wherever possible something that the business manages and owns themselves versus reinvesting resources from an internal audit perspective. So yeah, lastly, I just wanted to basically, as I kind of start off the session, we have a specific function or service line which is called Tech Assurance within Mobius. And essentially, just as my kind of bio illustrated at the beginning of the session, we've got a bunch of resources that have various certifications and various skills with regards to not only consulting and advising companies from a consulting perspective, but also stepping in and performing kind of assurance services or services to help supplement internal audit departments who are struggling with the current rates of change and requirements around change, which I've kind of illustrated throughout the presentation. So if anything now, I wanted to kind of jump through to questions if there are any. And then I was hoping that between Lavna and Yogesh, you guys could facilitate that process, just read through the various questions, and I'll give it my best go at being able to answer what questions you may have.
Yes, Candice, thank you very much for the presentation. I think we do have some questions. And
in fact, we have 4 questions.
Yeah, maybe Lavna, can you go through the questions?
Yes. So Candice, we have someone who has asked that, do you have an audit methodology commonly used by IT auditors?
Yes, so essentially we have our own internal kind of Mobius methodology, which essentially kind of stems from a best practice of a bunch of kind of existing methodologies out there. So yeah, we follow a specific one, but when you look at IT audit methodologies, the high level approach and everything usually is kind of focused around COSO, your normal kind of internal audit methodology and approach. And then within ISACA itself, there are a whole bunch of frameworks and the standards, which are, guidance which you can leverage off in terms of trying to, how do you approach IT auditing, and everything from how to create an annual IT audit plan through to, detailed working papers on specific audits for very specific areas. So things like change control, through to the implementation of specific baselines on specific technologies or platforms.
Thank you, Candice. So the next question is, do you think IT audit should move from traditional year-end audits to continuous auditing?
So that's definitely something we've seen being, I think there was a big drive towards kind of getting continuous auditing going. I do think there definitely is value in something that is more available real time, that kind of does a lot of work or kind of reduces manual intervention or manual work where required. So yeah, I think that definitely the trend is there and there are efficiencies in it. I think the only cautionary element to that is what you're auditing from a continuous auditing perspective has to change as well. So you can't sit there and literally just run the same tests that you ran for the last 5 years. There's an element of maintaining and improving those kind of continuous auditing control objectives and how you test things, so that it doesn't kind of stagnate and become stale over time.
Okay. Thank you, Candice. So we have another question like, do you believe that IT audit should form part of a cybersecurity cell instead of staying independent?
And what we've seen, that's something that it becomes quite a challenge. What we've seen is essentially the resource constraints, or the fact that there's so few people with the specific, skill set, especially in cybersecurity, is that in an organization that's not mature, or an organization that doesn't have, 100 different people who know or understand cybersecurity, there's often this expectation or this reliance placed on an internal audit function to perform that role within the business. But there definitely needs to be some type of a view of where you're going, how you're doing things, and independently being able to kind of attest to that, because there's always going to be this agency problem where if you are managing something, it's very hard to be open and honest and transparent about where you are in that process. So what we've seen working in other organizations, but it obviously does require kind of appetite for additional resources. But what we've seen is we have an internal audit department that will provide assurance over whatever the cybersecurity roadmap or program is. There'll be a risk or a second line function that will be almost where if you'd say like a CISO would sit, that person defines and directs the cybersecurity strategy, the information security management system. And then you've got in IT, the operational people who help drive and execute that actual almost strategy or that framework. So that's where you have the SecOps teams who are part of your SOC, or you have your IT security architects, people who define and kind of make sure that the infrastructure is architected in a secure way. So it becomes then that view of there being those 3 different levels or 3 different layers. I think it's very risky for that function to sit within internal audit. But unfortunately, what we have seen in practically speaking, especially in small organizations or in organizations that aren't mature, is that it has to start somewhere. And usually it starts from people who have a governance and a risk background, who would initially kind of find themselves in an internal audit role or function. Did that answer the question? I'm hoping. Just shout if my answers aren't answering the questions.
Sure. So the next one is, as far as we understand this from an audit perspective, how we see IT audit, but how do we convince management where the future of IT audit is?
I think you just literally have to probably go back to that 1969 slide and say, how different is the world that we live in right now, and how different it is going to be. It is only going to exponentially increase in terms of the level of automation, the level of outsourcing, the level of relying on third parties, the level of the cloud. All of this is only going to make the world even more connected, even more integrated. And if you go and look at IT risks, or just generally risks, if you even go and look at the Davos World Economic Forum, top of the 2 global risks in the world are, one is the digital divide or digital gap, so whether or not you're able to take advantage of and be part of the digital kind of revolution, and the second element is cybersecurity. If all world leaders are sitting, and every year in that top 10 risks come cybersecurity and cyber risk, from a audit and risk committee, it just seems completely ignorant of an organization to not consider or not want to get some type of assurance about how your organization is mitigating or keeping ahead of those risks within the organization itself.
Thank you, guys. And you spoke of framework, maturity models, and a lot of past and future coverage. Are both aligned?
Let me see. Trying to think how to rephrase that, what the question specifically asking, but essentially it's around, instead of retrospectively looking and saying, look, here's your control, we're only going to get involved when you've defined the control, we've deemed it to be adequate, and now we're going to perform effectiveness testing, and every year we'll look back at the last year or the last 3 months and tell you everything was fine. It is very much kind of a let's look back. When you look at maturity assessments, it's helping the organization work that journey. So you're still giving them an independent view of where they are, but you kind of not waiting until everything's done and dusted to then provide that assurance. You're helping them with the journey, and you're providing assurance in those small little micro steps as you can throughout the process and as they mature the control environment. So it is then that view of, now instead of looking backwards, you're looking backwards, forwards, and looking at what's happening currently.
Okay. And how frequently you use COBIT?
We use it quite a lot. What we have seen, there is been a move away from it, just in terms of it being able to keep up, and it's with the change in terms of terminology and the way people are adapting the agile approach. So there is a struggle between some organizations who are very mature and have implemented fully agile processes to retrofit what they are trying to do and the processes they are trying to introduce, and trying to kind of apply those in a COBIT kind of way. But it definitely is a good place to start, and it definitely is something that we see a lot of. We have seen a lot of it, but I am noticing a slight deviation or veering away from it, just where organizations are seeing themselves to almost feel that the framework doesn't speak directly to what they're trying to achieve anymore. But I think it's just more of a language and terminology thing that I'm hoping with the next update of COBIT, they would kind of have sorted out. Okay.
And do you agree that audit of technology is more relevant today?
Yes, definitely. More relevant than ever, and it will only become more relevant. It's not going to go away.
Okay. And should audit by design be done? Example, at time of implementation of cybersecurity system.
Can you repeat that again, Lavna?
Should audit by design be done at the time of implementation of cybersecurity system, for example?
What we're just seeing is that if you get involved earlier, the earlier the better. It embeds security by design. It forces and it mandates IT divisions to think about what they're doing versus just kind of implementing technology and implementing specific systems for the sake of implementing it. It just does mean that the tools and the technologies that are being purchased by the business or by the IT function are being implemented in a more kind of thoughtful process, and in a process that doesn't just consider availability, because that's usually what you'll see is that IT departments have all intention and good intentions of building something that is secure, but there are often drivers within an organization to get things in faster or cheaper, and that audit kind of mindset, or that assurance mindset around there needs to be stuff done in a very secure and a thoughtful process, a process that can be kind of validated and checked, a well-governed process. And if you aren't embedded from projects right at the beginning, there can be it can very easily become a afterthought, and it isn't necessarily something that then kind of gets bedded into a implementation project or implementation of a specific system.
Okay. And how to ensure internal audit is independent of security operation team?
So that's that whole view, is that ideally what you want to try and do is have your audit team doing the auditing. You want to have a risk role or a CISO kind of role, where someone who formulates a strategy, ratifies between the business and IT what the risk appetite is, or how much they want to invest, and then the actual IT team is responsible for day-to-day operations. So you can guide and drive control design as long as the IT audit team isn't the person who's in the SOC, isn't the person who's doing the incident response, isn't the person who's patching the servers. You are then independent of the actual day-to-day operational ongoings, and you're also not necessarily managing that team, or that team isn't reporting to you to say, am I doing a good job? Do I get a raise? Do I get fired? That's essentially then where you can keep and maintain that independence, and then defeat that whole agency problem in terms of being able to objectively surface what, where the true level of a control environment is, versus kind of an inflated view or reduced risk view, where someone's kind of reporting that for something that they kind of own, manage, and feel kind of attached to.
You have a few more questions, Candice.
Okay.
So do you think that with advent of emerging risks, IT auditing should move more towards agile auditing?
Yeah, I do. I think I had a very, I used to hate the word agile. It used to really get my, I don't know what you like, get my hair standing up on end. But I have seen now how, we just need to get away from the word agile, but it essentially just means we must be more adaptable. We must be more ready to act, ready to kind of jump in where we see risk. And I think that's where I started alluding to that fact that historically there was an annual audit plan. The annual audit plan was sometimes set up 3 years in advance. We need to be less rigid, and we need to be able to move with the business, so that if they say tomorrow they've acquired this organization to implement some new business process, wouldn't you want your internal audit division to get some visibility of that before it lands? If you're going to plan your audit program or your audit plan 3 years in advance, you've got no visibility of that kind of coming down the line, and to get no coverage of these emerging and changes as they happen within the organization, because the organization is becoming more agile, I think that would be a large risk. So I do think that internal audit has to become agile, and you need to try and also just make sure we don't kind of get caught up with the negative associations around, everyone says, oh, but being agile is less governance, is less documentation, is less, and I think that's just a bit of a mind shift that as an internal auditor myself, I've got to check up on myself, just to say, because people are saying agile, don't automatically dismiss that it's something that we shouldn't be doing. There is the correct way, and there is a way that if we do audit in an agile approach, it can help the business.
And what will be the challenges IT auditors will face with blockchain technology?
I think that is something that is going to be a huge challenge, because I think if anything, there's a very small, if we think information security is a tough nut to crack, and they're hard, we've got a hard road in terms of maintaining the right skilled people to kind of audit just cybersecurity, then auditing the blockchain is something else. So yeah, I think that definitely is something which needs to kind of be considered. I think it still is in its infancy, and it's still kind of proving itself in terms of its actual applicability in business to manage operations, other than, you know, funding some type of a currency, a global currency. But as and when it becomes more applicable to very fundamental business issues, there's going to need to be some serious upskilling within internal audit departments to make sure that there's someone who can kind of counteract, or someone who can give a view on, or have an opinion, and a valid opinion on something like that. So yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge, and it is something we all should be considering.
And how frequently do you recommend comprehensive IT audit exercise for onwards use by financial auditors?
Can you repeat that one again, Lavna?
How frequently do you recommend comprehensive IT audit exercise for onward use by financial auditors?
So you're saying how
frequently?
How frequently
Yeah.
should financial auditors perform an IT audit? I'm still not sure I understand it. Do you want to try and give it a...
The question is, how frequently do you recommend comprehensive IT audit exercise for onward use by financial auditors? Sorry.
Well, I'm still not sure if it's how often should financial auditors perform an IT audit?
Right.
Candice, may I chip in?
Yes, go for it.
Right. So I think that we have a lot of questions going around, and I don't think we may address all these tonight.
Yeah.
What do you think? So what I think is maybe we can ask all the participants to just chip in their questions, so that we can address that one by one. What do you say?
So I know that we essentially, I think we will be posting this recording on our website. Yeah. And I think what we can do is go through the questions that are on the Q&A list there, and we'll provide some responses. We'll type out the responses and pop them at the same location that you'll be able to find a recording of the session.
Yeah, I think that's going to be right, because otherwise we're going to go from a night tonight.
Okay. Yeah.
Or otherwise we can send via email as well.
Yes. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to send it. We either myself or Lavna, or otherwise there is info@mobiusconsulting.mu. You're more than welcome to send any questions you have that